Welcome to the Book Studio. I'm your host, Beth Ann Patrick, and I'm really pleased and honored to be here today with James Reston Jr. His new book, Defenders of the Faith, Charles V, Suleiman the Magnificent, and the Battle for Europe, 1520 to 1536, is out from Penguin now. Jim, thank you so much for being here.
Delighted.
It's really great to have you here. And you began the story told in Defenders of the Faith in an earlier book called Warriors of God. So let's set the stage a little bit for our viewers and tell them about what was going on and how these two incredibly interesting and rigid men came to meet.
Yes, well, Defenders of the Faith is kind of a completion of a series of books that in some ways are quite influenced by 9/11, where we had this clash of Christianity and Islam and jihad and crusade. And Warriors of God, the one that you mentioned previous to this, was about the Third Crusade of Richard the Lionheart and Saladin. Saladin is a great hero to the Arab world,
yes.
And to the
Another
Islamic.
pair.
Yes, right. But that was a 12th century story. But after 9/11, it seemed as if the American people really wanted to read anything that they could find about Christianity versus Islam, jihad versus crusade. And I think it's fair to say that maybe the only good thing that came out of 9/11 was that we needed to have our consciousness raised about the Islamic world and the Arab world, and also needed to know who their great heroes were.
And to know that they're separate, that the Islamic world and the Arab world are not necessarily one and the same all through history.
That is true as well. But in the past, and up until 9/11, I think these great stories of Arab and Islamic history were told either from the Western standpoint or from the Eastern standpoint. And what I was attempted to do, first with Warriors of God, then with a book that came between called Dogs of God, which was about the Spain of Christopher Columbus and the end of the glorious Islamic reign in southern Spain. Now, with Defenders of the Faith, the Ottoman Turks coming to the gates of Vienna in 1529 and again in 1532, you get this classic clash of West and East and Christianity and Islam. So, if only from our sense of security in the future, I think, in the environment that we're given today, we need to know who the great heroes were, what the pipe dreams are of the Islamic and the Arab world, and be aware of that because it's important in the whole mix of things
It is important, and that definitely leads me to my next question for you, which is, had Suleiman triumphed when he came to the gates at that time, the world would be quite different.
Absolutely, quite different in the year 1529. Suleiman the Magnificent is one of the most interesting figures in all of history. And when he came to the gates of Vienna in 1529 with a massive army, he really should have prevailed. And his pipe dream was that he would be an Islamic Alexander the Great, who would preside over an Islamic empire that would be India in the east, all the way to the Rhine River in the west.
With great cultural and economic importance.
These
were big dreams, but they almost came true. And so the corollary to that is, what can we learn today as modern post 9/11 Americans from studying this Renaissance clash of religious cultures? It's changed so much, but this does have something. Defenders of the Faith has something to say to us, doesn't it?
Yes. Well, I think the answer is history is vibrantly felt in the Islamic and the Arab worlds. These figures, Suleiman, and the one who took over Constantinople in 1453. These are stories that are told, to the whole Ottoman world at an early age, and that live vibrantly in their consciousness. So when George W. Bush, for example, invoked a crusade
that had great meaning.
6 days after 9/11, it had tremendous meaning. It was the greatest gift that he could have given to Osama bin Laden. to say that, you know, America was now going to go on a crusade against those who had attacked us. So instead of being portrayed as a mass murderer, Osama bin Laden could say, well, I will be the defender of jihad against this Western crusade that's now coming. And so that was, so history is really important to know in this environment, I think.
It is, and you have a very particular and interesting stance on looking at history that I want to make sure we mention. And I don't mean to be flippant by going from talking about 9/11 to talking about Hollywood, but you had an important role in the Frost-Nixon debates.
Yes.
And you have a book called The Conviction of Richard Nixon. And of course, you were portrayed by Sam Rockwell in that movie. And you've talked about that a great deal lately. But I'm wondering, what is it like to see the portrayal of your younger self in something that's taken on a life of its own as an historical event?
Yes. Well, that was an immensely flattering thing for me, because this was an event that I had been intimately involved with for a year of my life back in 1976 and 77, and had basically forgotten about it for 30 years. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, comes this play that's supposed to just be a little play in a 100-seat theater in London, and it suddenly is a huge hit, and it goes to the West End of London and on to Broadway and then on to Hollywood, and so they say the Reston character in the whole thing was the moral center of the thing.
Exactly, that you were the one, the driving impetus to making this very dapper character really go for the jugular, really ask the tough questions. Do you feel that that's who you were? Do you still connect to that?
Well, it's interesting, you know, I went back to Chapel Hill, North Carolina, where I was teaching creative writing after that experience in the 70s, and I wrote up a narrative of this whole thing, which ultimately becomes The Conviction of Richard Nixon, the book that the movie and play are based upon. And then stuck it away, and it was not published. So when this playwright and screenwriter Peter Morgan contacted me about this thing, I said, didn't I write something about that back there in 77? Out comes this manuscript. And suddenly there is the narrative of yourself 30 years ago. I'm sure I'm a little softer than I was back in 1977, but nevertheless, the passion was still there, and the absolute need to certify the decision of the nation to throw Richard Nixon out.
Well, the passion is definitely still there in your writing as well. And Defenders of the Faith, let me tell you, Charles V and Suleiman the Magnificent do not get off lightly. No. But I also encourage everyone to read it, because your prose is also magnificent. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, I'm delighted.
James Reston Jr., Defenders of the Faith from Penguin. And join us next time on the Book Studio.